Hello and welcome to Hey Festival's Book Club. Thank you for your patience. My name is Helen Marks, curator of the Conversations with Baldwin Festival, and I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's discussion of Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, an author with uncompromising style and prophetic wisdom whose 100th birthday we are celebrating this year. I've got the brilliant Colm Tóibín and Yassmin Abdel-Magied joining me this evening. Hello, Yassmin and Colm.
Hello, how are you?
Hi. Hi. Before we get into the book, a little housekeeping first. One, Hey Festival is a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. So thank you to everyone for your continued support and engagement. Giovanni's Room is the Hey Festival Book Club pick for February. Copies are available for purchase on the Hey Festival website, or you can buy a copy from your local bookseller if you haven't already. And then finally, Hey Festival Book Club is supported by Unwin Charitable Trust. And this month's event is in partnership with Words of Colour, hence why I'm here, a creative change agency allowing unheard stories to be told. Next month's selection is Rachel Preziz's Fresh Apples, with details about the event online now. So let me introduce my lovely guests and the book we'll be discussing tonight. Colm Tóibín was born in Enniscorthy in 1955. He's the author of 10 novels, including The Master, Brooklyn, The Testament of Mary, Nora Webster, House of Names, and most recently, The Magician. His work has been shortlisted for the Booker 3 times, won the Costa Novel Award and the Impact Award. He's also published 2 collections of stories and many works of nonfiction. He lives in Dublin. Hello, Colm.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm very good. Now, Yassmin Abdel-Magied is a Sudanese diaspora writer, broadcaster, and award-winning social advocate. A former mechanical engineer, Yassmin has published 4 books, written 2 plays, and is currently developing a number of projects for screen. An award-winning speaker and globally sought-after advisor on engaging diverse communities and inclusive leadership, Yassmin has delivered keynotes and workshops in 25 countries in Arabic, English, and a smattering of French. She founded her first organization, Youth Without Borders, at the age of 16, leading it for 9 years before co-founding 2 other organizations focused on serving women of color. Yassmin is currently a trustee of the London Library and on the executive committee of the Black Writers Guild. Her TED Talk has been viewed over 2.5 million times and recognized as one of TED's top 10 ideas. Hello, Yassmin.
Hi.
Hi, my very illustrious guest. Thank you. So now, the book we're discussing tonight is Giovanni's Room by the brilliant James Baldwin. For those of you joining us who don't know who James Baldwin was, he is a Black American writer of the 20th century whose literature really compelled the world for its searing social commentary on race, identity, love, and just who we are as humans. Giovanni's Room is Baldwin's second novel, and it's about a tragic love affair between an American expatriate and an Italian barman in Paris in the 1950s. A quick summary of the book reads that when David meets the sensual Giovanni in a bohemian bar, he is swept into a passionate love affair. But his girlfriend's return to Paris destroys everything. Unable to admit to the truth, David pretends the liaison never happened, while Giovanni's life descends into tragedy. It's beautiful, it's tragic, it's sobering in its storytelling. Every time I read this book, it devastates me. Tell me, Yassmin and Colm, how did you find the book this time?
Well, all right, I might go first. This time around, I often think that when you kind of revisit a text, that what attracts you to it tells you a little bit about kind of what is engaging you at that particular point in your life. I think the first time I read this book, or the first time I came across this book, was when I was first really being introduced to Baldwin. So like in my mid-20s, I had never really read literature by Black Americans. You know, I grew up in a very engineering house, so it was new and it was exciting, but I think I found it challenging in a way that I didn't fully understand. And this time around, revisiting, the things that struck me the most, I actually felt I found it interesting that I kept imagining David as a Black man, and that didn't happen the first time around, which I found interesting in myself, because race is something that, the fact that this is one of Baldwin's few, maybe only novel that's only about like white people, and I kept having to remind myself that David isn't actually a Black man. The narrator isn't a Black man. This is, an experience of a white man dealing with his inability to deal with his own sexuality and so on. I found that an interesting response, and it's something that I'm still kind of reflecting on. Why is it? And is there something in the kind of inability to sit with oneself that I recognize in the sort of conversations around racial injustice? But also I felt more perhaps touched by the conversation around home being this irrevocable condition, and maybe living abroad and the escape that you think living abroad will give you is never actually something that you can find. That the sort of the saying that wherever you go, there you are. And I think that was also something that struck me as I was revisiting it this time. But yeah, Colm, I'd be fascinated to hear what you thought.
There's a novel that's just been reissued by the New York Review of Books. It's called The Stone Face by William Gardner Smith. And he was also an African-American writer, and he was from Philadelphia. And he came to Paris more or less in the same years as James Baldwin. And when we see his book and Giovanni's Room, we can then, I think, see Giovanni's Room in a way more clearly. Smith's book is really about being Black in Paris in these years and what it meant, and what all of them spoke about. And it comes up in Richard Wright, who was another African-American writer who had gone to live in Paris, in the world of the Black painter Beaufort Delaney, who had gone to live in Paris, that there was a freedom available to Americans, Black or white, but if you were Black American, you had a freedom in Paris. I mean, with nobody stopped you going anywhere. You could go into a restaurant, but you could also walk in the streets with a white woman, and nobody would look at that and say, well, that those things that you just simply couldn't do, or couldn't do easily in America, you could do easily in Paris. But Smith's book says the thing to watch was what was happening to the Arabs, that the Algerian War was on at this time, and the enemy was not the African American. The enemy, in fact, was the Algerian. And so his images are filled with Algerians being beaten up on the street by French police, as well as the Black guy from Philadelphia walking in the streets with his white girlfriend and no one stopping them. So you can see what's not in Baldwin's book. And that is, I think, very deliberate, that Baldwin made an artistic decision that he was not going to deal with the internal, what we might call, the Algerian War or French politics. And he was not going to deal with the easy business of how, the easy drama of being Black in Paris. These things were something he was not going to do.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's interesting, I think, with you, Yassmin, picking up on, what this slippage of David being Black is with Baldwin, because I've been listening to the biography that David Leeming wrote recently, listening to that recently. And Baldwin, David is sort of got a bit of David's got a bit of Baldwin in him, and that, Baldwin was kind of trying to reconcile his own sexual identity and him putting part of that in David, but also part of himself in Giovanni, as this lover who just wants this great love and wants someone true who will be with him. And so it's really interesting to see these two characters, kind of these different parts of Baldwin. But then to go back to what you're saying, Colm, about why Baldwin chose not to talk about the tensions between the French and Algerians. I think it's also he really didn't want to be boxed in as a Black writer. And so I think the book was very much him saying, I know all the white agents, white publishers, white readers, I know this is what you would think I'm going to do because I've been writing reviews on Black books for the past couple of years now. I feel like this was very much him saying, I'm going to step outside of your own box for me and do what you don't expect. Whilst also still wrestling with his own ideas and putting that on the page. You see so much love in this, or at least kind of the seeds of it as he goes on to express them in his later book. So for me, this was the third time reading the book. I mean, what stood out to you most about the novel? I think the last time I read it, David's cruelty, I just could not get over how cruel David was. But this time around, I think it's the sort of virtuosic quality of Baldwin's writing, just the prose, just sort of like carrying me away. And I just feel like my emotions just sort of like being brought to a tilt and just sort of having to stop myself and sort of go back. I just like, because that's what he's doing. That's what he's doing to me. He's stirring me up. So what about you? What did you find this time when you were reading it?
I'm gonna reply to that and also build actually on something that Colm said that I think, so I want a personal reflection. So I lived in Paris for about a year, and I'm sort of Sudanese and Muslim, so kind of Arab, African, Muslim, and in my mind I was like, yes, I'm going to be a Black writer in Paris. I'm going to be I'm going to live out my James Baldwin dream. Of course, not quite realizing that I'm not going to be read as Black in Paris. That the sort of that existence is not, especially since I'm not American, I'm going to be read as Arab and Muslim, and that experience is completely different. And so that it's an interesting reflection, I think, also in that conversation about race in Paris or in France in general, because I think we like to, or the conception of race in an American context does not obviously port over to France, but I think it is actually so much more different that we don't, it's often not really engaged with at all. So I appreciate that intervention, Colm, because I think, especially in that particular era, the Algerian War was in the part of the world where I was reading literature from, that was, a key part of the lived experience. But to come back to your question, Heather, like what struck me almost heartbreakingly was how much of, in the context where, this is being written in an era where independence movements are being fought, where, Algerians are literally being killed on the streets and thrown into the Seine, that this is a character whose pain is completely internal. And like and that, to me, I was so struck by how can it be that someone can live in such pain and can inflict such pain on others, that shame, that kind of overwhelming, crippling, and kind of it living at the same time, the lust living at the same time as the kind of revulsion in amongst, in the same moment. How that is so internal and completely invisible to the external, the outside gaze. And I think that's, for me, what Baldwin does so well in this book is, this might be a story about a man who had an affair, the simple, easy story, a man who had an affair, it didn't work out, one person ends up having a tragic end, but he breaks up with his fiancée and kind of goes off with his life. But actually there's just layers upon layers upon layers going on inside, and such pain that we get access to through this work, and yet, yeah, I mean, even the moment where Giovanni, he sort of speaks to his pain at being kind of thrown out. So for context, for those who haven't read the book, there's this moment Giovanni is a sort of a poorer, undocumented kind of worker from Italy who gets thrown out by the sort of very exploitative boss at the bar, and he's humiliated in this way. Like, David doesn't have those experiences. David has a father who can send him money from overseas. Giovanni is being kind of treated in this very obviously humiliating way, and yet he is not the one with the kind of levels of shame that David experiences, at least certainly from this reading. Anyway, I've gone on. Colm, you tell us. What do you think?
Yassmin, I think you're making that this point is really important, that David is actually an American. And and he comes in that tradition. For example, we get it in Hemingway, we get it even in Henry James in a novel like The Ambassadors, we get it in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, that this American male in Paris is almost predatory in the way he wants something and he wants to go home without that thing. And so the falling in love with him is the most dangerous idea, because he will abandon you. And he will, of course, as you say, also internalize. He will be not only introspective, but in fact quite narcissistic. And even as the novel opens, It's a performance. He's describing himself. He's describing what he will have. It's a figure in the theater. He has his back to you as the curtains come back, and then he slowly turns and wants to tell you the story from his side. What's curious, however, is that it isn't efforts all the time to self-justify. You could see why he might want that. It's self-lacerating. He actually is an old-fashioned American who blames himself. He's an old Puritan who thinks, was I the one who did wrong? Yes, I was. And he makes Giovanni this much more free, sexual figure who, can fall in love with a man and it doesn't bother him. That's not the question. The question is the question of love. And so this then becomes, I think, a novel about love. And I absolutely take your point, Yassmin, as well, that there are moments when you think, get over his whiteness. Like, he's not white. He's just not. What if you made him black? How interesting would that be if they were just in a room together? And the Italian waiter, as you say, undocumented, but filled with a certain sort of ease in life. And he would, I think, be more complex if he were black. But Baldwin made it, it was a serious decision, and his agent told him, you burned that book. But that was about the same content. You burned that book. Knopf, his publisher, dropped him. So he had to really start again as a sort of artist who everyone presumed was going to be a prophet, because he was coming out of Harlem with new, fresh stories from Harlem. He made a deliberate decision in his first novel not really to include any white people in his book. It's about internal pressures, about religion, family, sexuality in a Harlem community. When he came downtown with that book, people thought, he's the one we've been looking for. He will tell us the news of Harlem. And Baldwin just decided he wasn't going to be that prophet, or that, if you want to know what's going on, ask Baldwin. He went to Paris for many reasons, but one of them was to stop being a sort of spokesman for an oppressed community. He just felt that white role, the role that whites placed him in, was stultifying and was confining, and he went elsewhere. He made a decision. So we have to put up with it, Yassmin. I think we just have to pretend that there are moments when he might be black, and then we just turn the page and he's white. And Baldwin is obviously playing with us, and it's nice.
I love it. I would say that it more is a reflection of my kind of internalized expectations of Baldwin, in the same way that everybody else had expectations of Baldwin, rather than, I think I love how rebellious he was and how stubborn he was, and how he refused to sort of, as you say, be the spokesperson and sort of accept the position that everyone thought that he should accept, right? I find that such a, it's a difficult role, because I think even his own peers kind of were irritated by him. Like, he wasn't falling in line. But I think, that's the artistic position, really.
Yassmin, I want to try and read the book as a gay novel, and that the word room becomes important here, because anyone who's been through this, and I'm old enough to have been through it, where as a gay man in a city, you're oddly invisible. You learn how to pass, as it were. You learn how to get down the street without anyone noticing you. And suddenly you realize that this invisibility is eating into various parts of your soul. And so the only place, in fact, you're free is in a room with another man. But because there's no context for that, because once you leave the room, you're utterly invisible. There are no rituals surrounding you. It isn't as though they have other friends who are gay people of their age. The older gay men are nasty, and the younger gay guys are just on the take. So in the middle are these two figures, utterly isolated, with no hinterland, with no community, with no sense of visibility. And the city of Paris becomes, in the novel, strangely invisible itself. He doesn't do set scenes of, Eiffel Towers, Tuileries. He doesn't do all the beauty of Paris. Paris is often in this novel, Giovanni's room, empty. They walk the empty streets. They, of course, he finishes work late, so because Giovanni works in a bar. But nonetheless, I think the idea that David can't love might be explored as the idea that who could love in this situation where there's no context, no society. There's just constant invisibility. And there's constant pressure. And so every time you leave the room, you're nobody. And then back in the room, the possibility of making a nest or happiness or something pure is impossible, because the pressures from the room becomes a pressure cooker rather than a haven. And so it is, in one way, I suppose, a gay man's effort to dramatize what is a particular plight for gay men in the 1950s, which is that no one can see you. And you, in ceasing to be able to see yourself, you cease to, things atrophy, or things don't go in the way that with a man and a woman just walking in the street, meeting in a cafe, realizing there are things for them in the future, such as advertisements people are going to sell things on the basis of what a man and a woman look like together. Well, try that in the 1950s with two gay men. So these things mattered. They ate into the heart. Forget about the soul for the moment. They ate into the heart. And Baldwin's book is about the coldness, the sheer coldness of the heart that then develops.
Yeah, thank you, Colm. I think it's, you reminded me of as I was beginning to reread this book, one of my dear friends, who's a gay man, said to me that I asked him if he wanted to reread it with me, and he was like, this was the first book that he read that he felt seen in, and he almost didn't want to read it again because he didn't want to touch the memory of experiencing it for the first time. And that was running through my mind as I was reading the book. Like, what is it to have this book to make you feel seen? What does it say about the experience? And also the room itself, not only is it a pressure cooker, but the words that Baldwin uses, the stink of it, the mess, like these are not cozy, homely words. The room is not something necessarily where you've got open windows and lots of natural light. The windows are painted over. The bookshelves that you're building are scratched into the walls. I mean, these, I think there's something so compelling and tragic in Baldwin's trying to show. And also, I guess the one other thing that I wanted to add that came to mind as you were talking was there was the scene of David making eye contact with a sailor as he's sort of walking along on a boulevard. Right. Yeah. And this moment of revelation and this kind of the invisibility and the fear of actually being seen, because what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about Nella Larson's book called Passing.
Yes.
You know that book where
yes.
Black women who have very light skin would attempt to see if it was possible. And this becomes, in one way, a comedy, but in another way, of course, one of them is married to a white man who has racist views. And you watch this developing as a sort of tragedy. But for gay men, there's a brilliant moment in the book. I think it's a great moment where David is trying to get along the street. And he realizes he's caught the eye of this sailor. And for 1 second, all his efforts to look straight, to look like he's not acting for a straight man, but is one, have faded, have gone. And the panic, the moment of, it isn't just that he's caught my eye, he has seen me. And it's a great moment in the book of a sort of, for once, he's become visible. But being visible frightens him much more than just being on his own in the dark, as it were. And it's one of those really great moments. I think any gay man reading it just go, I think I know that.
I mean, I want to go back to what we were saying about the room column, about kind of it being this particular space for these two characters who are gay. One of them tried to hide it more than the other. I think, that room, I think it sort of serves to be this sort of like crucible of transformation where David can either face himself or run away. And it's interesting, like that moment where he encounters the sailor, and kind of also there's other moments where he catches himself being, I guess, more outwardly gay than if he was in the room with Giovanni. And it's almost like the room is slipping out into his real life, in his outside life. Because like Giovanni catches him and then smiles, and then immediately David retracts as though he's like ashamed that he's been caught again outside of the room. And it's interesting the language that Baldwin uses to describe that room. There's one moment where David describes his life there as occurring underwater. And it kind of just reminds me of, Baldwin's, him being a preacher boy and, water, baptism, and, the way in which, David, it is a baptism, like what that room is, it's messy, it's not lovey-dovey. Like that is what it's like to face your fears and come out the other side. And so I wonder, like, what you kind of, I guess, also maybe exploring more of that room and kind of the fact that it is in this constant state of clutter and mess, how that fits in with David's, I guess, looking at himself, facing himself in that room, in that space.
I think that the novel is a confession. And so it's written in the high style of somebody facing the facts for the first time of what he did, what he caused, who he was. Yeah. And so it has a sort of religious tone to it. Mm-hmm. And so it tends to do very broad sweeps of sentences, describing motives or a certain moment, or when Hella, who's his girlfriend, returns. It doesn't do minute detail of the buttons on the coat or where exactly the kettle was in the room. Kettles, things like kettles, saucepans. He doesn't bother with that. He's interested in the large question. The room becomes, but it's domestic space to some extent, but it also is a place, a cage, a place where you're trapped, a place where you feel as though you're underwater. But I think the style of the book is quite grand. It isn't like a lot of novels, including some that I write myself, filled with tiny little details, so it builds up a picture of a world gradually, incrementally. This tends to be more theatrical, depends on voice, manner, style, tone. And so what you're doing is you're following a voice. Now, your problem always with a novel written in the first person is how reliable is this fellow? How unreliable is he? And I think Baldwin solves this problem to some extent by making him quite self-lacerating. And that it is as though in this night, the night before his friend will be executed, because he's committed murder, been found guilty, Giovanni, David will, on his own in the south of France, turn towards the mirror or turn towards what's real and true. And for once, and it's that lovely idea, you're reading a novel, this will only be said once by this man. He will never again be able to face these facts. So you're watching a pure piece of self-dramatization. And that is what holds your attention. The fact that the voice will not relent, that he will not try and forgive himself or say, I didn't really mean it. It will be quite tough. I think that means, of course, you mentioned him as a preacher. That Baldwin was a child preacher in Harlem at the age of 12. He was one of those kids who came out and knew the Bible, and the big congregations listened to him. So as a novelist now, and I mean he wrote this book when he was what? He was about 30 years old. He's not interested in seeking easy forgiveness. He's interested in telling the truth once. And you get a zeal in that, I think, which comes from certain readings of the Bible.
Yeah, definitely. And I think him at this point in his life, he was just so, I think because he was going through that, facing himself and kind of trying to be honest with himself, like no longer shying away from the fact that, oh, maybe I might want to date women and have relationships with women. It's like, no, I'm gay. I like men. I can only have relationships, and this is the love that I want. And so, but also him figuring out the artist that he wants. I think he's very much like, it's like, this is the sort of precipice of him sort of diving into this really searing honesty that he holds himself to and that he wants to hold other people to, particularly America and Americans outside of America. And so, I mean, Yassmin, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what you're talking about naturally kind of leads into, some observations that Hella makes, Hella being David's character's fiance or ex-fiance. There was this bit, and I'm going to see if I can actually pull it up, because it's this kind of, it's the moment when she kind of realizes, she's kind of clocked that David, has been having a relationship with Giovanni, that the relationship with Hella was never real, was never actually real, could never be real. And she says, "I'll never understand it," she said at last. And she raised her eyes to mine as though I could help her to understand. "That sordid little gangster has wrecked your life. I think he's wrecked mine too. Americans should never come to Europe," she said, and tried to laugh and began to cry. "It means they can never be happy again. What's the good of an American who isn't happy? Happiness was all we had." And I just thought that was it's brilliant, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's something amazing about to happen in New York, which is that the Metropolitan Museum has a show just opening this coming weekend about the Harlem Renaissance. And it's going to include work by a great number of painters in Harlem, African-American painters in the early years of the 20th century. When the Met did such a show, I think 50 years ago, it was about Harlem, but it didn't include any painters. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because they said there weren't any. That, Harlem Renaissance had writers, they had, balladeers, they had jazz, but they didn't have painters. And people protested outside saying, like, what are you talking about? We should do some research. Where's your scholarship? So I think there's a rethink going on at the moment, just a relook at the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the most fascinating things that I've just found out is that, a lot of the writers, people like County Cullen, for example, when the Wall Street crash occurred, their income went down and they weren't able to move as easily. So they became school teachers, some of them. And one of them, County Cullen, the poet, became Baldwin's French teacher. And so Baldwin's in Harlem, which is, of course, is a deeply oppressed place. It's filled with, the police are the problem, and yet his French teacher has lived in Paris, has published books of poetry, has become a, cosmopolitan bohemian figure while being rooted in Harlem. And it just gives you a sense of the richness and I suppose complexity of that childhood of Baldwin's, that he pictures it sometimes as being, he was a shoeshine boy. Well, he was never a shoeshine boy. But at the same time, he was brought up in great poverty. But I went up the other day in Harlem to look at his school, the school he went to. And the school, it's a beautiful building. And so, he was lucky to some extent that he went into, he'll be 100 years old in August this year. So he's born in 1924, which means that really by 1934, 35, 36, he has amazing teachers. We know their names. We know what they did for him in a way that someone maybe in a high school in Harlem now would not. They brought him down to the public library in 42nd Street in Manhattan. They made sure he was reading. They oversaw his learning French. And so it gives you a sense that when he went to Paris first, which I think he did in 1948, 49, at the age of 24, it wasn't a journey that he did alone. In other words, his teacher had done it. People, I suppose the best way of seeing Harlem in the 1920s was via Paris. And a great number of the writers went there, of the African-American writers, to live, to spend time there. And so Baldwin's presence in Paris wasn't merely outsider, looking through the window, but there was a sense of confidence. And there's a funny confidence and swagger about Baldwin sometimes, that he as an essayist, quite early on, is the early 20s, an essay called The Harlem Ghetto, written in 1948. You can see just how ready he is to take on the world, how fluent he is, how his style.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, as you're saying that, Colm, it makes me think that, Baldwin and his contemporaries are writing as if they, deservedly and entitled, they feel like they're entitled to be writing this narrative. They're not writing from a place of apology. They're not writing from a sort of crouched position, whether they're in Harlem or in Paris. They're writing from a sort of, arms wide open, like this is our arena, as it has been the arena of those before us. And I think that is something that, other writers and other groups of people took longer to get to, because there was more work, perhaps they thought of themselves as the first rather than walking in the footsteps of. There was kind of more work to get to that sort of, in my mind, the image is sort of peacock feathers out from the get, from your early 20s, which is a pretty incredible place to be. And especially if you can kind of hold on to that, if it isn't sort of beaten out of you at an early age.
Should we, with the I mean, Americans in Paris, that whole, I mean, Baldwin himself was kind of guilty of that, Americans in Paris sort of, using it as a bit of a playground. Go back to that quote about Hella and kind of that, what's the good of an American who isn't happy? I love that line. It's kind of like Daisy in The Great Gatsby with the beautiful shirts. I think, really thinking of David and just how, destructive he is in the novel, what is the destructive aspect of like American innocence or Americans clinging to particular myths or roles in Giovanni's room? That maybe like what Baldwin is trying to work out in himself and in the other Americans that he's seeing in Paris, be they black or white. What do you feel like he's that, I guess it's like that myth of innocence, that delusion, that naivety, whether it's like the myth of an individual that we cling to or like the myth of a nation, whether it's America, Britain, France. I
mean, what strikes me as you ask that question, and also in that it's a sense of innocence, but also a kind of delusion of, of light touch, right? Like a delusion that our presence here is simply for our own pleasure, as opposed to playing any kind of, like, not really thinking of the weight of the position, not really thinking of the kind of the gravitational impact, the sort of the gravitational field around you as an American in a foreign country, especially in that particular time, especially in a place like France, especially, while all these other independence movements are happening around the world. And I also think there is a resistance, and maybe I haven't read enough to kind of grapple with this. There is this delight as you speak, Colm, to this idea of like, yes, we can get freedom in a place like France, but it took not all sort of Black social justice or African American social justice figures did like, the Malcolm X's, and you have Marcus Garvey, who had a more Pan-African, position and so on. But many others sought freedom for themselves and did not necessarily take that moment to think, well, how is that then connected to the movements, to other kind of movements? Why was it that that there aren't more, like, I guess, to me, when I think of, say, the Black American in Paris, I think of the Black American person who's in the military in the contemporary kind of world today, who thinks of himself or themselves as an oppressed figure within their own domestic nation and cannot conceive of themselves as a tool of the imperial kind of project of the United States of America. And I think that's something that, that is maybe unresolved in this book, and I wonder if I was to have that conversation with Baldwin, where it would land, because I don't know necessarily that the answer is there.
One of the things that he begins to think about in Paris is his own Americanness. Yeah. And because he gets to meet a good number of the Francophone poets and writers who are in Paris, people like Senghor. And there's a conference held. And Baldwin realizes, yes, I'm Black, they're Black, my origins are African, yes, they're African, we're all writers, we're really based in France, we're coming back and forth to Paris, but I'm an American. And I didn't know that until I met Senghor, until I met the Francophone African writers in Paris. And the same thing happens to Obama when he goes to Kenya, where he suddenly, it's a lovely moment in his memoir where he says, I think I might be an American. And it's a strange thing to think, because you, of course, think, but in what way am I an American? How strange it's taken this journey to France for me to come to that conclusion. What an odd fate to have your nationality suddenly come to you as realization. And the second thing, of course, is he writes a wonderful essay about being the only Black guy who's ever, he thinks, appeared
in Switzerland. Yeah, that's a beautiful essay. Beautiful essay. I highly recommend it. I can't remember what it's called, but I recommend it.
Is it called A Stranger in the Village?
Stranger in the Village, yeah.
Yeah.
And he has to think, and I think if you're Irish and if you're Sudanese, it might actually matter, where do I own Shakespeare? What am I going to do? What am I going to do with, Rembrandt, Shakespeare, Chartres Cathedral, all the great icons of sort of, the outside world. And of course, if you're African American, it's more extreme. But he starts to think, well, they're mine in whatever way I can make them mine. He's not going to say, they're absolutely not. I, as a Black American man, cannot read Shakespeare. But he's saying, of course he's mine, but I have to constantly navigate that. So I think that it certainly keeps him alert and alive, work out who am I and what am I? And they're the two great questions that he has a tremendous amount of fun with. In Giovanni's room, of course, he doesn't have fun with. In other words, he sees the damage, that sort of, that David is in Paris without a peer group. It's not as though he's come with an army or indeed a group of friends or a whole set of American writers. He's utterly isolated except for his girlfriend. And what's odd about the novel is how few people are in it.
I think actually that's a really good point to bring one of the audience's questions, because there's that thing about, Hela and the way that Baldwin writes women in this novel. One of the questions from Ellis, thank you, asks, do you find the presentation of Hela, David's fiancée, to be misogynistic? And then I've got a follow-up question to this as well, because I also find it the way that Baldwin writes these different women in the book. I'll go to Yassmin first.
Yeah, I was thinking about this actually as I was rereading it and thinking, how do I feel actually about Baldwin's, writing women, and also it almost felt like, I don't know, my initial kind of thought was, this is a sort of a place, like this character is a placeholder for any kind of woman, right? Like I don't necessarily feel like Hela is a specific woman. I feel like she sort of represents women in this story, and that's about David's sexuality. It's not actually about women at all. Like, her kind of her ideas about, well, I'm only good for having children, and this emancipation, and she sort of flirts with some feminist thinking just a little bit here and there, but really she's there as a sort of in my view, a sort of stand-in for heterosexuality, and maybe there's sort of the flatness of it in Baldwin's perspective. I don't know, Colm, what do you think?
I think you're doing pretty well. Everything you say is what I look. She's not. There's certainly no one going to say that she's a great character. I'd love to play her part in a movie. I mean, it's an impossible role because the other relationship between David and Giovanni is so intense. It's so filled with love and then hate, with wanting to be and then not wanting to be. And suddenly Hela comes back from Spain, and you just go, Hela, don't come back just yet. Give it a week. And you realize from the writer's point of view, he doesn't want her either because he really has no idea what to do with her. Now, my point would be, and I don't know what you think of this, that to move this into misogyny is a bit rich. It's a bit quick to say misogynistic, but he doesn't imagine her. He doesn't give any space in the book. But to call that misogynistic, in my view, is going too far. I think it's artistic failure, actually, which is, I think, is a serious offense too. But misogynistic is I think nowadays, if you use the word, it's pretty extreme.
I wouldn't say he hates Hela. Like she's not written in that way, right? So I don't think that I kind of leave thinking that this character has been treated cruelly or anything like that. But I do think you're right. It is an artistic failure because I don't think there is any internal landscape to her. There is no rhyme or reason to the way that she thinks or what she says. She just sort of appears, plays a role. Like it would, what are her stakes? What does she actually care about?
And I think, again, we can see an alternative to this, which is the figure of Lady Brett Ashley in Hemingway's Sun Also Rises, who's so filled with life, when that everything she does and says is interesting and funny. But obviously Baldwin didn't want that. It would ruin the book if she arrived from Spain and was the funniest person alive. It would bring down the tone of the book to some sort of level that it's grandiose, its grandeur would dissipate, I think, quite easily under those pressures. I should say that Baldwin did create a great, there is a great female character who is Ida, the sister of Rufus, in his novel Another Country. And her first appearance in the book, when she comes down from Harlem to say to these white people in Greenwich Village, "Where is my brother? What have you done with my brother?" It's like Antigone coming down from Harlem. And then, he brings her down to a level where she becomes she falls in love. She moves in and out of that world, and she is, I think, brilliantly created. But I mean, it is very much based, I think, on his own world, on one of his sisters, on the women he knew in Harlem. But Hella, poor old Hella, who wants to play Hella?
I mean, that kind of leads me on to a question that I wanted to ask just for fun, was because I know Baldwin, he wanted Marlon Brando to play David in a stage adaptation of Giovanni's Room, but the didn't line up and couldn't do it. Who now, if you could pick, if you had some in mind, who would you pick to play David or Giovanni for that matter, an actor today? In my mind, I'm thinking of Jacob Elordi, who's in Euphoria and Saltburn. I think he would make a great David, because he's like tall, he's kind of got like lean football like physique, and I don't know, he can do the sneer, he can do that contempt really well. I don't know, what about you guys?
Is David, have I just imagined this, or is he blonde? Is David blonde? He's blonde, right?
Wow. Okay.
I think, who's the guy that plays Captain America? Oh my God, all the names are going to...
Chris Evans.
There's something about, I feel like Chris Evans gives that sort of restricted sort of energy, that sort of self kind of loathing. I mean, our skinny French American friend, who should definitely play Giovanni, who was in Call Me by My Name, or Call Me by Your Name. All of the names are disappearing from.
Timothy Chalamet.
Timothy Chalamet. I mean, is he not Giovanni?
Timothy Chalamet for Giovanni.
Yes.
I was thinking about the young, I mean, you can't push time back, but the young Jake Gyllenhaal, who would have that turn on an extraordinary charm.
Yes.
And then you could feel that when he turn away, some sort of darkness would come over him. And it's also, of course, two of them together. I think the age thing is slightly wrong, but that's a really great idea. I noticed that the Baldwin estate, I think there's only been one movie of a Baldwin novel, which is Beale Street.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah, which did very well.
We're still waiting for the movie of Go Tell It on a Mountain, which would, and I think they were talking to Merchant Ivory at one point, but this is years back, about Giovanni. But it's never been made, and I think there's always been a lot of interest in making it.
And the way that it's so cinematic and the way that Baldwin writes it, it would be so good. Yeah.
You would need the right casting though, because so much of it is so internal, like dramatizing the internal, would really require.
It would take a lot of work for the actors to, the constant business of really longing for each other, and then finding that longing to be something that, certainly on David's side, moved very quickly into not longing, and then moved into hate. And the other being more and more comfortable as all this went on. Who would you have play Hella? Because you see, if you wrote the script properly, you could make Hella into quite an interesting, who saw everything, who knew everything, and who knew also that she was taking him home over her shoulder very soon, David.
In my mind, it would be like you. I think just from that. I think it just reminds me of Little Women and kind of these women who could go to Europe and kind of have little trips. But then, I mean, that's also kind of the set that Baldwin was moving in. These kind of they had some money. They came from money families. Maybe they're a bit down and out in Paris, but they were kind of like liberal sets, that kind of bohemian life. But then I'm actually just going to marry someone and then have some babies. I feel like,
what about Emma Watson?
Yeah, but if Rooney Mara came into the room, you say, she's going to bring him home. I know what's going to happen. You could make it into a sort of triangle.
Right. That would be also, sorry, go ahead, Heather.
No, I was just going to say, because it's like people describe it as a triangle, but then I think Hella is no competition. Like the way that Giovanni just smacks David in the face with it is this full-on love, like love affair, love inferno that I don't think anyone else can compete. I mean, anytime he sees any other person, he's like, oh, maybe I desire them. But then no, it's just Giovanni's face before him and the desire there. It's like Giovanni is under his skin. So
You're absolutely right, Heather. You're absolutely the triangle where one of the angles doesn't really do angle. You know?
It's a very narrow isosceles triangle.
You could call the production company Isosceles Productions.
Right, exactly.
I'll bring in one of the audience's questions here from Thomas. Oh, maybe I'll go to Keris actually. Keris asks, what do you think about the ending? So the ending is with David. He's at the house in the south of France. He's getting ready to go, and he's tearing up the letter. I love that bit where he's tearing up the letter that Jacques has sent him and tells him about the Giovanni's execution date. And then as he's walking away, he throws it away, but then the wind blows it back onto him. I just love that as an image. What about yourselves? I'll open up to Colm and Yassmin.
I mean, I thought it was interesting that it kind of, you know, and it always reminds me that, as you say, Baldwin was a preacher boy. It becomes very wrapped up in sort of, you know, there are Mary, Blessed Mother of God. There are sort of biblical references. The scene of Giovanni being taken into the execution room. Again, there's another room. It's a dark room. Yeah. There's this kind of language around Giovanni's beginning a different journey. And I mean, I think it's a difficult book to end, but I think it kind of leaves us. It leaves us with the end of Giovanni. It leaves us with Giovanni's execution, and also leaves us with understanding that David. I think maybe Colm said earlier, like it is the one moment he will be honest with himself and never again. And I think that's what we get as resolution as readers. Like this is not a fully reconstituted American man that is now going to, like we don't know what he's going to do next necessarily. But for me, it was satisfying in the sense that like the arc was, will he ever have a single moment, where he looks at himself? He hasn't looked at himself since that day that he had the experience with Joey as a child. That this kind of the death of his lover finally forces him for a mere second, a mere moment.
I was trying to think of something that the book is like. We're always looking for, is there another book? And I found Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, which Wilde wrote in prison, and was a letter, and it was written in the first person. It's all voice as well, to his lover, really blaming Bosie, his lover, for many things, but blaming himself for many things too, and saying many things for the first time that needed to be said years ago, and now with a heightened tone and a sort of self-accusatory texture being said now. And it's the same idea that when the letter is written, you feel at least that has been said, but it's not as though that might change anything. But the whole idea is the performance, the actual, that the time spent saying it is, I suppose, the drama. And the afterwards, you've no idea we never know who's going to repent, do we? But I have to say that it's really hard to know how to end that particular book, because you don't want to end it with an image that's too comforting, too all-encompassing, too totalizing. You want something that's going to leave the possibility that he's just going to walk away and go back to settle down. Although I have to say, if Hella is badly imagined, I would have thought the other outsiders in the book, the David's father and the background to his life in America, it's very sketchy, because the intensity of the now in the book is so great. It's very hard to do backstory in a book like that.
Yeah, I mean, it does do enough to kind of set David up as a sort of this, good American Protestant boy, with this, I guess it's interesting because he's got, to go back to this idea of, the women in this book, you've got his aunt, what's her name? Ellen. And she's interesting as kind of, I don't know, the sort of figure. It's like she can kind of see the man that David might become, because there's that moment where she says, David's father, you need to talk to this boy, talk to him. but they never have that conversation. They never talk. And she's kind of maligned by both David's father and by David. And I wonder if it's because, you know, she has this foresight, or she has this demand for them to be honest, and they both shy away from it. And it's something that other characters in the book say. I think it's Hella. Men never speak first. I'm always waiting for the man to speak. And it's, yeah, this kind of, so it's interesting. It's very interesting. I think we've got time for one more question from the audience. Let's have a little look, see. Who will it be? This is an interesting one from Dylan. In the book, there are many passages and mentions of being watched, seen, or observed. What do you think of this?
I think for gay men, maybe for everybody, but for gay men, let me just speak for gay men, for all gay men. The gaze, the business of watching and being watched. I think maybe not so much now because everyone's online. Everyone's watching at their screen, but there was a time when a gay bar was all gay men watching, and the quality of your gaze became something quite significant. So yeah, the bars are all the bar they go into is all about the men watching, the older men watching the younger ones, the younger ones watching each other, and of course the eyes become. I mean, the first eye contact between David and Giovanni is more important than anything they said to each other, because, you know, the question is, what language do they speak? Because the language of the eyes, actually. And one finds, I mean, David finds that language is not enough.
There's this beautiful passage, I just had to find it, where it's that moment in the bar, and David and Giovanni, they've been talking, it's been cute, he's like, oh, maybe something's happening here. And then Baldwin writes, and then he took his round metal tray and moved out into the crowd. I watched him as he moved, and then I watched their faces watching him, and then I was afraid. I knew that they were watching, had been watching both of us. They knew that they had witnessed the beginning, and now they would not cease to watch until they saw the end. It had taken some time, but the tables had been turned. Now I was in the zoo, and they were watching.
Wow.
I mean, just how could we end on a better note?
Really good stuff, because he's not
Brilliant.
afraid of repetition. You know, they're watching, watching, and the word becomes a sort of bit of poetry when it just begins with just describing an act, and that lovely way he can create cadence by using repetition of individual words in the book, which I think really is one of the special things about the book.
Yes. Well, I think they're telling me we've got 2 minutes left. So, but I mean, is that 2 minutes to close, or 2 minutes for us to just wrap up our lovely discussion of this book? I think, is there anything that is you know, we've had this time talking about all these different elements of the novel of Baldwin and kind of what we're getting from it. Is there anything that, you know, still stands out that we've not covered tonight?
I think it played a very important part in gay life at a certain point, because there were very few books you could give to another guy and just say, look, why don't you read this? In other words, if we're going to face into a future together, if we're meeting, if we're in a city and we have a room, read this. And there wasn't really another book like it, you know. And this is, I'm talking right through the 60s, into the 70s, even perhaps into the 80s. This book became, because it was always in print, and it was easy to find with the other Baldwin books in the bookshop. No one, you know, people could think, oh, you know, even if you bought the book, no one would look at you in the 70s, because it was James Baldwin, the black writer. It must be about civil rights or something. No one knew about it. It was a sort of secret book that, I mean, I noticed, for example, there's a famous English court case with Jeremy Thorpe, and the book he gives to the young man who he wishes to seduce is Giovanni's Room. It's in the court case. And I remember reading that. I must have been about 20 something. I think, I gave him Giovanni's Room. Well, yeah, he would. Yeah, that's the book. And so it had not exactly a forbidden book, because of course no one knew about it. You know, people, no matter, Baldwin got away with writing it, by the way. I mean, he wasn't persecuted for writing it. Some way or other, everyone managed to ignore that book and pretend Baldwin was still the lovely writer from Harlem who would, you know, write the great essays about civil rights and African American freedoms. But even to this day, I notice when he's been discussed in this context, no one wants to say the GR words, Giovanni's room, because it doesn't fit in. And that would have pleased him so much, the idea that I'm that my right as a man, even he questioned that category even as man, but my right is to shapeshift, is to be anyone I want to be in my imagination. That is what novelists do. I mean, Shakespeare could write Hamlet and Lear. How come I can't go to Paris and be a white guy?
Yeah, I definitely, that shape-shifting ability is a perfect note to end on, and it being such an inspiring note for artists everywhere, really. So I just want to thank you both for such a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Colm and Yassmin. And I want to thank the team at Hay for inviting me and you both for putting on tonight's discussion. Thank you. And then thank you to our lovely audience for sending in such brilliant questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to ask them all, but they've all been wonderful. And just thank you for bringing such wonderful reflections on this book. So the details for next month's book club, they're on Hay's website, talking about fresh apples in March. And early bird tickets are available for Hay Festival 2024 in Wales. They are out now and the full programme is coming in March. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Thank you, Yassmin.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Pleasure talking.